This is Puzzle Problem Mess. Conversations about the media economy and how to think clearly when things get messy. In this episode, I'm joined by Ian Whittaker. Ian is a London-based analyst with over 20 years' experience covering media and technology equities, and he's one of the clearest voices making sense of the shifts underway in the media sector, particularly around advertising and marketing. In this conversation, we focus on the rise of YouTube and why broadcasters and content owners continue to struggle with where to place YouTube in their strategic thinking. Here's Ian Whittaker. Ian, the debate around the ascendancy of YouTube tends to be anchored around its enormous audience scale. But is that the right frame for thinking about YouTube?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, first of all, let me just say YouTube is a great platform. So there's no doubt about it. The content you govern it is hugely wide-ranging, obviously used for a variety of topics and so forth. So it is something where when you look at it, you think, wow, this is, to actually bring such a library together of content has been fantastic. Having said that, certainly when it comes to advertisers and the way that they should look at it, is that you really do have to take YouTube as its own unique beast. At the end of the day, if you look at the content that is shown on here, you've got a huge variety of things there. It can either go from full-length movies, full-length sort of programs, all the way down to extremely short clips. Some professionally generated content on there, but a lot obviously is amateur as well. There's no filter here. And I think that's a key point with this. Yeah, some of the more sort of aggressive comments about YouTube sometimes refer to it as a bit of a swamp. I don't think that's necessarily correct, but at the same time, yeah, there's no doubt about it when you look at the content. You've got some of there that is going to be attracted to advertisers, the professionally generated content. You've got a lot where, quite frankly, advertisers probably want to stay well away from. The issue we also have with YouTube is, quite frankly, when it comes to visibility, there's not a huge amount of visibility on what actually constitutes viewing on the platform. So there was a survey by the BBC that I think turned around and said the average median views is around 41 views for a video. Yeah, if you looked at the average time spent on the video, it was around 60 seconds on here. Everyone always goes on about Mr. Beast and how important that is, but that's sort of at the very, very tail end. Most content, when it comes to YouTube, quite frankly, if it's outside music videos, kids, and whatever professionally generated content is on there, quite frankly, most of it is going to be fairly amateurish. And that raises the question for advertisers who are thinking, if you want to reach an audience, what's the type of audience we want to reach, and in what context do we want to reach them as well? So I think trying to put YouTube into a particular bucket, saying YouTube is TV, YouTube is something else, it's something a bit more unique. Obviously got quite a lot of close links with the likes of TikTok and so forth, but I think from advertisers' standpoint, the way they should look at it, as I say, is really to consider it as of its own kind. And when it comes to its advertising strategy, that will drive their decision-making process.
Got you. And why do you think broadcasters and content owners, as well as advertisers and marketers, struggle with where to place it in their strategic planning?
Well, because there is still this debate that goes on as to whether YouTube is competition for TV advertising money or whether it's supplementary to TV audiences. I think this really boils down to, if you step back and think about this as what's the bigger level, the higher level question here, is that do people follow platforms or do they follow content? If you believe that they follow platforms, then if you're a broadcaster, you can see the sense of actually putting content on YouTube. Because the argument would go that younger audiences are no longer watching television, and therefore what's happening is they've migrated to platforms such as YouTube and TikTok, and therefore broadcasters should put their content on those platforms in order to capture those audiences. Now, my view is that audiences actually follow content. Yet if you want to take this to its extreme, if you had like a bunch of just inane nothingness on YouTube, would audiences go there? Of course they wouldn't. People want content to watch. They follow the content that they like. And so my view on things is that essentially the way the broadcasters need to think more about this is the content is actually critical. And it's not so much necessarily that being on YouTube will deliver them sort of more audiences. I would argue that maybe it's a stepping stone, but realistically, if you are a broadcaster, what you want to do is you want to get those audiences onto your own platform, watching on television, or probably more likely your own streaming platforms. Because at the end of the day, why share your revenues with YouTube? Yeah, it is far better as a broadcaster to take 100% of the cut rather than, let's say, 55, 60% and so forth. And I think what's happening here is this is the fundamental question that broadcasters are struggling with. There's been a lot of talk about the fact that, yeah, that YouTube delivers audiences that broadcasters cannot reach. Yeah, implicitly what that is saying is that essentially those audiences have been lost to broadcasters forever. I don't believe that's the case. Yeah, a lot of content, we don't know the figures because quite frankly, we don't have any sort of visibility from the YouTube stats. But presumably a lot of the content on YouTube will be professionally generated content, either in its long form nature or that will come from short form clips. If those are attractive to audiences and audiences like to watch them, then what broadcasters need to think is, okay, this is our content. How can we monetize it most effectively? And how can we think about this sort of strategically over the longer term? And what that would suggest is that, fine, use YouTube as a temporary, let's call it, strategy in order to reach those audiences. The ultimate goal, though, should be to get those audiences to come to the broadcaster's platform. And I think when it comes, your question about why is it the broadcasters still don't know where things sit, in my mind, broadcasters still haven't worked out fully, both in terms of what is the sort of wider audiences watch content, what is it that attracts audiences, and that's the key question that needs to be resolved as well. And also as well, the longer term strategic thinking is, and working through the rationality of, if audiences still very much follow content rather than platforms, and most of our content is actually driving large audience views on YouTube, logically what we should be trying to do is get those people across to our own platforms. And I don't think that's, it will be happening in certain places. Disney, I thought, was quite interesting with their comments last week at CES for Disney Plus. But I think most broadcasters haven't fully thought through yet the strategic implications over the long term of what they need to do with content and where YouTube fits into that.
It's really interesting, that push and pull between content and platform, because there's a race against time in that the longer an audience cohort is habituating on certain platforms, the harder it's going to be to get them off platforms or to think about other platforms.
I think that's true, but I mean, the broadcasters have certainly shot themselves in their own foot, in their own feet, rather, over the past couple of years with their strategy. One thing that is interesting on this whole debate is, if you think about how the advertising market traditionally has worked, it traditionally works on the idea that not all content is the same. That we've got premium content and peak times that therefore deliver a premium over, let's say, daytime, and also as well just low quality content. One of the sort of big underlying questions that you've got here is that whether that distinction still holds or whether it fades away. And it doesn't really matter what sort of people watch and what time of the day that they watch it, or indeed are they watching it in a mass market cohort. I mean, if you boil it down, the sort of phrase, the attention economy, sounds like a great catchy phrase, but what it ultimately says is that all viewing time is the same. Doesn't matter what content you watch. Yeah, it could be AI slop, it could be premium content. That actually doesn't really matter. What matters is the percentage of viewing that takes place. And arguably, a lot of what's driven, going back to the question before about how broadcasters see YouTube, one of the things that broadcasters need to be wary of is, increasingly, if you look at the debate, is taking along the lines of, if you have this percentage of viewing, you should get this percentage of advertising money. And for a broadcaster, that's probably a negative scenario if that becomes the default. Because again, your whole model has been based on the idea of premium content, some content is better than others. Peak times, sometimes they're better than others. And the scale that comes through from a mass market audience. That sort of thing of your share of advertising equals your share of audience. And it's a very simplistic calculation. That's one that really benefits the tech platforms. Because quite frankly, their great weakness is their business model is not set up to produce professionally generated content. It just doesn't work, particularly when you get outside the US, which is why you never get the platforms going after major sports rights in Europe, except at the marginal level. The business model just doesn't work. So essentially for these platforms, what they need is either it needs to be other people's content on there, or what you want, if you're going to take advertising money, is essentially say, it doesn't really matter whether the content is premium or not. It doesn't really matter what time it's shown at. All it is a very simple calculation of saying this amount of audience gives us this amount of advertising share. And so from a standpoint of the broadcasters, they need to start to think in those ways. And one of the areas, and it comes back to what we're saying about the strategic mistakes they made before, one of the areas they should be thinking about, for example, is kids. If we think about kids programming, the reason why kids are on YouTube is because a lot of the content was cut out from TV. But if you look at actually one of the strongest arguments that the likes of YouTube has at the moment for taking TV advertising money is because it's got a large audience share. Where a lot of that audience comes from, it comes from kids. It comes from kids who are watching programs like Bluey and Cocomelon, etc., on YouTube. And therefore, what YouTube is able to say is we've got this amount of audience, we should get this amount of advertising money. Now, that doesn't take into account that if you're a kid, you haven't got any spending power, so what good are you to an advertiser? There's the obvious question of, well, do kids actually maintain their viewing habits as they move forward? So I think that is a question that's very much open to debate on things. But there are things that broadcasters can do that are quite simple to move the dial back in their favor. I think what they have to do, though, is they have to start thinking strategically. And at the moment, I would say that it's starting to change now. But certainly the pattern has been for over the past couple of years that broadcasters haven't thought in a long-term strategic way.
Now, obviously, the biggest advocate of the YouTube is TV label is YouTube. And why do they care about this so much now?
Well, as I say, it's always follow the money. I worked in banking for over 20 years, and either directly or indirectly, of what will happen is you always look at where the money trail goes, and that gives you you can usually work out what people's incentives are. I think the timing of this is very interesting. Look at when the whole YouTube is TV argument really took off. It was in late 2024. And really, I think there's a very strong reason for that. First of all, if you actually take what's been happening on YouTube's advertising growth over the past several years, the growth rate has really decelerated from where it was in pre-COVID days. Pre-COVID days was growing in the 40s and the 50s, year-on-year advertising growth. If you actually look at it now, it's around the low to mid-teens. Probably will be around, again, 14%, maybe for 2025. Now, that's a very good growth rate, certainly compared with TV, but obviously it's decelerated from where it was before. And actually, if we compare the YouTube advertising growth rate with, for example, that of Google search, YouTube's advertising growth rate is only 1 to 2 percentage points above Google search. And that's been the case for the past couple of years. So there's definitely been a deceleration of growth that's come through. And also as well, when you look at it, the deceleration matches very closely to the rise of TikTok in international markets. Now, we know the ByteDance numbers because there are numbers for that. We don't know exactly what TikTok's international revenues are, but certainly from the reporting from the likes of Bloomberg and Wall Street Journal, it would imply that you're probably looking for 2025, you're probably looking at TikTok overtaking YouTube advertising revenues and potentially by a significant amount. You could be looking at a gap anywhere between 10 to $15 billion. If some of the reporting is correct. And that gap seems to be just expanding wider and wider. So I think for YouTube, another issue why they want TV advertising money and why this debate has kicked off is, quite frankly, when it comes to the social media market, from what can piece together from news sources, it looks as though YouTube is losing share, in particular to TikTok. And therefore, if YouTube wants to accelerate its revenue growth rate, it's got two options. One is it can actually grow its subscriber revenue growth rate, and it's been doing that very successfully. Although, again, if you look at the back end of 2024, there was a quarter there where essentially that growth really decelerated. And I think that may have also prompted the YouTube is TV advertising growth argument. But also as well, you need essentially to take a new pot of advertising money. Advertising money is still very much siloed. People still look at it, particularly in both the advertisers and the agency space, a pot for digital, a pot for TV. If you look at the 2024 YouTube advertising revenues, they were around $36 billion globally. That's a large amount. TV, though, was around $170 billion. If YouTube can actually take a sizable proportion of that TV advertising money, it can reignite its growth. And the easiest way, because advertising money is again still siloed, and that's the way that people think about it, is to get YouTube inserted into the pot of TV advertising money. And that's fundamentally why we're seeing this debate. Sure, there might be an argument about content creators, and it might be the whole debate that people are saying, well, what are people watching and how are they watching YouTube? As far as YouTube is concerned, those are means to an end. Okay? They're not the fundamental goal here. The fundamental goal is to take a sizable chunk of the TV advertising money. And to go back to the question before as to how broadcasters think about this really is the central point that broadcasters need to realize, that for all the nice words and all the nice tone, this is a fight for advertising money. And in this case, we all like to think we can expand the pie and maybe equal to a small degree, but it's really about taking share.
Gotcha. And any final thoughts on what broadcasters, streamers, content owners can do to better navigate this mess, this fog that's around YouTube at the moment?
Well, I think the first thing is to have a clear plan and clear strategy, and that involves actually working out what is the core competency of a broadcaster, and also as well YouTube, where that fits into the role. For me, the core competency of a broadcaster is to produce video content that appeals to a mass market audience. Yeah, usually professionally generated content, but it doesn't necessarily have to be so. Think about broadcasters, what has been their core strength? Yeah, they have 70, 80 years of experience of working out what sells to a mass market audience and why that is appealing to advertisers. That's the way they should think about things. I think the problem for the broadcasters at the moment is that there's still a lot of mindset of television broadcasting equals 30-minute shows in a particular format. Sure, we can stream them, but it's sort of, that's the mentality that still very much goes on. I think what broadcasters need to realize is that actually, if you think about your core competency in that wider context, then actually that opens up the possibility of you actually showing a lot more content. For example, why is it broadcasters can't get into short form content? Disney Plus has said this last week, but it's something I've been saying for the past several years. A lot of the clips that you see in terms of short form are from professionally generated content, news clips, sports clips. Even DIY is something where broadcasters produce content in that area. So there's a lot more that broadcasters should be doing around their content. I think also as well, they should look a lot more at expanding in the kids market, because again, going back to this point before I said, the share argument is becoming increasingly important, and an easy win for broadcasters is to actually attract more kids onto their platform. Again, there's a question mark over advertising, but still, I would argue what TF1's doing in France, trying to make it the YouTube of France, that's ultimately where broadcasters want to go, and saying, look, why can't we show music content? Because music, again, is like to be a large percentage of YouTube viewing. In fact, again, if you work together, the sort of comments that have come from YouTube's music head, you can see that in the advertising numbers, you can see that in the revenue numbers as well. And so I think what sort of broadcasters ultimately need to get to is the goal of thinking we become the ultimate destination, yet in terms of video content that appeals to a mass market audience. Doesn't necessarily mean it needs to come out of a production studio. You can also as well, and again, something that I've been saying, you can co-opt content creators as well. Because ultimately, as Mr. Beast says, the YouTube economics don't work. For many content creators, television still remains the ultimate goal. So ultimately, what you want to do, I think, if you're a broadcaster, is start to think, we need to think like YouTube. We need to be that ultimate destination for content in many different realms. And the broadcasters have a big advantage because they can produce that professionally generated content that YouTube's economic model won't allow it to do. And where that therefore means sort of where YouTube sits within their strategy, my view of it is that essentially they should look at YouTube as a stepping stone. You don't want to become too reliant on it. You need to realize as a broadcaster that actually after your advertising money, you also need to recognize as well that by providing content, you are feeding their audience share, which is enabling them to go back and say, we have this audience share, we therefore should get this amount of advertising money. But in the short term, use them, but the long-term ultimate goal should be to get people to watch your content on your platform. And there's probably going to need to be cooperation for that between various broadcasters at the back end level. I mean, in Europe, for example, could you see the sort of emergence of national sort of domains? Could you see things on the programmatic side? Absolutely. There's many things on the back end where I think greater cooperation makes sense. But ultimately, what the broadcasters need to be thinking of is we want to get viewers on their own platforms. And again, you've got your content. If you're a broadcaster, it's your content. What you want is 100% revenues for that content. You don't want to be sharing that with somebody else. Mm. And particularly somebody else who said at the end of the day, we could talk about this, in nice terms and so forth, but ultimately it's after your advertising money.
Slight change of tack here now. There are people who are earlier in their careers than you and I. What practical tips might you have for people who are making their way in media today, who are early or mid-career, given the ambiguity that seems to be around the industry?
I think the general, you obviously need to have knowledge, but I would argue in this sort of environment, what's key is flexibility. And flexibility comes from areas like, for example, always keep a good social network going. Social skills, I think, will become increasingly important. Creativity, I think, will become increasingly important in this sort of environment. You think about the things that aren't predictable, can't be replaced by AI, because at the end of the day, AI is going to replace certain types of jobs. The things that AI will find most difficult to do is creative, spur of the moment thinking that isn't so predictable. Now, that's very, very hard to put in a career plan as to what people would do. And I would argue what it probably means more is people need to think more about their soft skills rather than necessarily needing to know about their hard skills. The hard skills are obviously important. You need to know the job. But I think increasingly that will be seen as a given. What will be the differentiator between people when it comes to jobs? It's more the softer skills, how they interact. Can they think laterally? Can they think in different ways? I'll give you an example from banking. 30 years ago, when I was looking at investment banking jobs here in the UK, the sort of subject that the investment banks are most commonly hired for in terms of degrees, at that time, the most commonly degree held by sort of people who are hired was classics. And then it was followed by history. And actually, if you did business studies, that was seen as a negative. And the rationale that the bank used was to say, look, the actual hard knowledge, we can teach somebody in a training program. That's fine. But actually, the reason why we go for people who do classics and history is because of the way they think. the way they approach a problem, the way they look at something, and then they break it down and come with a solution on things. And I think that's not to say that suddenly everyone should rush and do a classics or history degree, but it is to say that I think what we're going to get is we're going to get things circling around. That I think that if you look at where careers have been very much focused on over the past 20, 30 years, certainly 20 years, has been more about the sort of efficiency, hard knowledge. Go off and do coding, go on and learn Python. Well, look at that now. Increasingly, it looks like that knowledge can be replaced by AI who can do that work for a fraction of the cost and work 24 hours. The softer skills, though, the way that you think about the problem, the way that you approach it, the way that you look at it, the way that you communicate with people, the way that you reach a solution that, quite frankly, AI would never even think of. I think those things are going to be more and more important. So I would say, don't get yourself fixated and say, my lifetime career will be X. Think about it more saying, what are the sort of skills that you can build up that you will make more flexible, that when change does occur, you can actually take advantage of it.
Fantastic. Ian Whittaker, thank you very much for your generosity, insights, and your time as well.
No problem, Dan. Thanks very much for having me.
That was Ian Whittaker. Thanks for listening. I'm Dan Fay. The original music in this podcast was by Lee Brossevier and SoCal. And if you think a colleague or friend would enjoy this episode, please pass it on.